Now let's take a look at the head, neck, and face region. This is Chapter 5 in the Trail Guide to the Body text. With me today is Todd Zerker. He will be one of the primary models that you'll see throughout this DVD series. The first muscle that we're going to focus on is the sternocleidomastoid. We'll begin by activating or contracting this muscle. So Todd, can you tuck your chin to your throat and raise your head up? You can see the distinct margins or borders of this muscle located here. Here's the clavicular head, and here's the sternal head, the more superficial. And relax. To palpate this muscle, we'll first identify the landmarks. This muscle originates on the top of the manubrium, the medial 1/3 of the clavicle, and it inserts onto the mastoid process of the temporal bone and the superior nuchal line. To palpate the muscle, we'll have one hand underneath the head and neck so that the head and neck is in a slightly flexed position. We'll rotate the head to the same side just a little bit. We're going to use a pincer palpation technique. We'll start at the mastoid process, and we will put the thumb and the finger around the muscle belly using a pincer palpation. We'll trace this muscle all the way down to the top of the manubrium. We'll turn the hands over and use a different style of palpation to palpate the tendinous attachment on the top of the manubrium.
Oh, Mr. Bone's back again. I just had to pop in to talk about the quality of the technique that we're seeing here. This guy, Clint, he's a pro. He's a pro because he's practiced palpation technique extensively. It's important to practice palpation not only for palpation technique per se, but to become a better manual therapist. That's what it's really all about.
Come back up to the mastoid process using the same pincer palpation technique. We'll slide in towards the midline of the body, rotate the head just a little bit more so we can get a hold of the deep belly. Trace this muscle belly downward as far as we can as it passes underneath the superficial belly and attaches onto the medial 1/3 of the clavicle. We'll change to a different pincer palpation technique, and we'll palpate the tendinous attachment site on the medial clavicle. To palpate this muscle, we're going to rotate the head to the same side with the head slightly flexed. We'll start at the mastoid process, and we're going to palpate the sternal head, which is more slender and superficial. We'll just walk our way down the muscle. And we'll palpate the attachment on the manubrium of the sternum right here. And then we're going to go back up and we're going to palpate the deep belly, which is the clavicular head. So we're just going to roll over this for a minute so we can kind of see. There's the superficial belly. Now we're going into the tissue just a little bit more with a pincer palpation technique, and we're palpating the deep belly. I'm strumming across it here. Work our way down. And then we have to transition to a different hand position so that we can palpate this tendon as it inserts onto the medial clavicle. It's a flat tendon down here. Now we're going to palpate the 3 scalene muscles. The scalenes are located between the sternocleidomastoid and the anterior margin of the upper trapezius. We have the anterior scalene, the middle scalene, and the posterior scalene, which is tucked back and behind here. So we'll begin by contracting this muscle group. So Todd, can you tuck your chin and raise your head up? We can see the muscle belly here of the anterior scaling underneath the SCM. So that's underneath the SCM. And then we have the middle scaling located here. And the posterior scaling is tucked back in and behind between the levator scapula and the middle scaling. And relax. We'll begin the palpation by locating the transverse processes of the cervical vertebra. So we need to locate C1, transverse process, C2, C3 is where the anterior scaling begins. So this is on the transverse processes of the 3rd through 6th cervical vertebra on the anterior tubercles. So we want to slide in front, behind the SCM and on top of the tubercle. So C3, C4, C5, and C6 is the origin of this muscle. And then we're going to just use a flat palpation to trace that muscle belly down. As it dives underneath the clavicle here and attaches onto the first rib. We'll come back up to the transverse process of C1. Now we're going to locate the middle scaling. So the middle scaling is located on the 2nd through 7th cervical vertebra on the posterior tubercles. So this is the transverse process of C1. There's C2. We'll slide behind just a little bit on the posterior tubercle. C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, and all the way down. And we'll attempt to palpate C7. This muscle is larger. We can roll over the muscle belly here with a flat palpation. Runs downward also underneath the clavicle and attaches onto and inserts onto the first rib. So the middle scaling. We'll come back up to the transverse process of C1, and now we're going to locate the posterior scaling, which is a little bit more difficult to locate. We have the transverse process of C1, C2, C3, C4, C5. So C5 we need to slide onto the posterior tubercle, is the origin of this muscle. C5 and C6, posterior tubercles, that's the origin. This muscle runs down and inserts onto the second rib, which is oftentimes not palpable. It's hard to locate that because the first rib gets in the way. This muscle is tucked between the middle scaling and the levator scapula, which runs up and attaches onto the transverse processes also. So we want to slide back in towards the midline of the neck, and we can move over this tendinous, stringy muscle belly located here. First, we're going to contract these muscles. We're going to rotate the head away. And Gina, can you bring your arms up? Abduct the arms, externally rotate them. We're going to bring them up to about a 90-degree angle. And then we're going to instruct her to tuck her chin towards her throat, raise the head up. Good. So we can see the sternocleidomastoid here. Underneath that is the anterior scaling. Here's the middle scaling. And then tucked in and behind the middle scaling is the posterior scaling. And relax. And gently bring your arms back down. We'll begin with the anterior scaling, which attaches onto the transverse processes of the 3rd to the 6th cervical vertebra on the anterior tubercles. So we'll find the mastoid process located inferior and posterior to the ear, and we'll transition anterior and inferior just a little bit more to feel the bony prominence of transverse process of C1. We'll palpate that transverse process, and then we sink in just a little bit more.
Palpating in this area can be a real pain in the neck. I really do want you to be cautious about palpating in the anterior triangle of the neck, because lying below we have the internal jugular vein, we have the carotid artery, and we have the cervical lymph nodes. We have to be cautious here because the nerve roots exit just between the vertebrae, which you are trying to palpate on looking for those attachment points on the scalenes. Be careful, ask for feedback, and I'll see you later.
To feel the transverse process of C2, and then we're going to locate C3. At C3, we're going to bring the head and neck back slightly, slide underneath the SCM onto the anterior tubercles of C3, C4, C5, and C6. This muscle continues to travel down. You can feel the muscle belly. Continues to travel down and inserts onto the first rib. We'll come back up, and now we're going to palpate the larger middle scalene, which attaches onto the transverse processes of the 2nd to 7th cervical vertebra on the posterior tubercles. We'll find the mastoid process, slide inferior. There is C1 transverse process. Slide towards the midline of the body, there's C2, and we'll slide behind it. So C2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and C7. It gets a little bit more difficult to palpate that transverse process here. This muscle also travels down, so we can slide across the muscle belly, the bulk of this. You can see very clearly as my finger moves across this muscle, and it makes its way all the way down, and once again inserts onto the first rib. The last muscle is the posterior scalene. The posterior scalene originates on the transverse processes of the 5th and 6th cervical vertebra on the posterior tubercles. So we'll use our same technique. We'll locate the mastoid process, slide inferior and anterior to locate the transverse process of C1, move in towards the midline a little bit more, we'll find C2, C3, C4, and then here's C5. We're going to slide on the posterior aspect of the posterior tubercle, C5, and C6 is the origin. This muscle travels down and inserts onto the second rib, which is somewhat difficult to palpate on a lot of people. Now we're going to palpate the masseter muscle. The masseter is located along the zygomatic arch, and it inserts onto the angle and ramus of the mandible. And what we're going to do is ask Gina to clench your teeth. Go ahead. We can see this muscle. We can feel the outlines. We have two overlapping bellies that run down and attach onto the mandible from the zygomatic bone. And relax. We're going to begin at the zygomatic bone. Right at the arch. And then we're just going to use a flat palpation to feel the muscle fibers as we move inferiorly to the angle and the ramus of the mandible. The underlying belly can also be felt. Go ahead and clench your teeth. You can feel a portion of the underlying belly's fibers running this direction. The upper or more superficial belly runs this direction, and the deeper belly runs, we can feel that portion of that running down towards the ramus of the mandible. Now we're going to palpate the temporalis muscle. This muscle originates on the temporal fossa and fascia. So outlining that muscle above the ear, it goes behind the ear and down and inserts onto the cornoid process of the mandible, which is difficult to palpate because we have the zygomatic arch and the zygomatic bone. So we'll begin by contracting this muscle. We'll come just a little bit superior to the muscle, and we'll place the fingers onto the muscle belly. And Gina, can you clench your jaw and relax? And again. And we can feel the muscle contract underneath our fingertips. So we're going to find the zygomatic bone in the arch, come just above it, and we're just going to use a flat palpation, strumming across the muscle belly, exploring the borders of this muscle. So we have to palpate through the hair, through the fascia, to feel the muscle fibers. You can feel the transition once we move on to just the bone and the fascia. The muscle feels a little bit thicker. We'll come back down to the zygomatic bone, and we're going to ask Gina to open her jaw, and we're going to palpate. There's a little indentation that we can slide into here. We're going to palpate the cornoid process of the mandible. We can slide across that and feel the muscle fibers. It attaches onto that cornoid process of the mandible. And relax. The head, neck, and face can be an intimidating region to palpate. This is typically based upon the fact that there are numerous delicate structures that occupy this region of the body. We strongly suggest that you develop rapport with your client and a good communication system that will allow you to navigate and locate the different anatomical features of the head, neck, and face.